For 14 years, she scrubbed floors to bury a secret that could get her killed. Nora Ashcroft wasn't her real name. It wasn't even close. She'd erased herself from existence to survive, until one careless collision in a marble hallway exposed the trembling, broken instinct of a woman who'd been beaten into silence as a child. Now the billionaire who employs her wants answers. And somewhere out there, the men who buried her truth 14 years ago have just found out she's still breathing. If you want to see how far this story goes, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. Let's begin. The cartwheel caught on a seam in the marble, and that was all it took. One uneven tile, 1/2 second of bad luck, and 14 years of careful invisibility nearly came apart in a hallway that smelled like lemon polish and old money. Nora Ashcroft had pushed that cart down that same corridor for 6 years, twice a day, every day, past the same gilt-framed portraits of Ashbourne men who'd been dead longer than she'd been alive. She knew which floorboard creaked under the runner near the east wing. She knew which window let in too much glare at 4 in the afternoon. She knew this house the way a soldier knows a minefield, every inch of it memorized, so she'd never have to think, never have to feel the ground shift under her. So when the wheel caught, and the cart jerked sideways, and a stack of manila folders slid off the top and burst open across the floor like a dropped deck of cards. It wasn't bad luck that scared her. It was the hand that reached out to catch her. She didn't see him coming. That was the first failure. 6 years of vigilance, and she hadn't heard him round the corner, hadn't smelled the cedar and rain in his cologne until his shadow already covered hers. By the time her brain caught up, his hand was already moving toward her shoulder, fingers spread, palm open. The universal human gesture of, "Let me help you." Her body didn't wait for permission. Both arms shot up and crossed over her head. Her spine folded forward like something snapping inward, like a question mark drawn in fast, ugly strokes. She made herself small, smaller than a grown woman should be able to make herself. And she went silent. No gasp, no cry. Just breath sucked in through her teeth and held, while her whole body braced for a blow that was never going to come. 3 seconds. That's how long it lasted. 3 seconds of a 41-year-old woman curling into the floor like a child waiting to be hit, while loose papers settled around her feet and the hallway clock ticked through the silence like it was counting something neither of them wanted counted. Then she straightened. Fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that comes from practice, from years of knowing you only get a second or two before someone notices you flinched, and you'd better be standing normal by the time they look twice. "I'm sorry," she said, already crouching to gather the folders, already not looking at him. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashbourne. I didn't see the edge of the rug. Nora." His voice wasn't sharp. That was the strange part. It wasn't the voice of a man about to write someone up, or fire someone, or even ask the obvious question. It was quiet, almost careful, the way you'd talk to something wounded that might bolt if you moved wrong. She didn't answer. She kept stacking papers, edges lining up too perfectly, hands moving with the kind of precision people use when they need their hands to be doing something other than shaking. Riker Ashbourne crouched down across from her, close enough that she could see the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples, close enough to smell the rain that had followed him in from the courtyard. He didn't reach for the papers. He just looked at her. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir." "Did I scare you?" A pause. The kind of pause that, in this house, in this life, was its own confession. "No, sir. I just lost my balance." He let that sit between them for a second too long. Long enough that she felt the lie sitting there too, fat and obvious, the way lies always feel once someone's actually paying attention. "Okay," he said finally, and stood, and held out his hand, not to touch her this time, just to offer, palm up, an invitation she could take or leave. "Let me help you with these." She didn't take the hand. She gathered the last folder herself, stood without his assistance, and loaded the cart back up with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her whole adult life making sure she never needed anyone's help with anything, ever, because needing help meant depending on someone, and depending on someone meant they could hurt you. And being hurt was the one thing she had sworn, at 12 years old, in a basement that still visited her in dreams, she would never let happen to her again. "Thank you for asking, sir," she said. "I should finish the West Wing before lunch." She pushed the cart away from him, wheels rattling over the marble, and didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes on her spine the whole length of the hallway, and that, more than the flinch, more than the silence, more than anything, was what told her something had just changed that she couldn't undo. Riker Ashbourne did not go back to his office. He stood in the hallway for a long moment after she disappeared around the corner, hand still hanging slightly open at his side, like it hadn't gotten the memo that the moment was over. He'd built 3 companies from nothing. He'd sat across negotiating tables from men who wanted to destroy him and walked away with their signatures on contracts that gutted them. He read people for a living, had to, in a world where every smile in a boardroom was a knife wrapped in courtesy. And in 38 years, he had never seen a flinch like that. Not startled, not surprised, trained. There was a difference, and he knew it the way you know the difference between a flame and a burn scar. A startled person jumps. A startled person yelps, laughs it off, says, "God, you scared me." What he'd just seen wasn't a jump, it was a drill. A body that had rehearsed this exact motion so many times that it no longer needed her brain's permission to execute it. Arms up, head down, spine curled, silent. Silent. That was the detail that wouldn't let go of him. Most people, even scared people, made some kind of sound. She'd made none. Like sound itself was dangerous. Like she'd learned, somewhere, sometime, that crying out only made it worse. He walked to his office on the 2nd floor, the one that overlooked the East Gardens, and sat down behind a desk that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and for a long time he didn't touch his laptop or his phone. He just sat there with his hands flat on the wood, replaying 3 seconds over and over, the way you replay a car accident, looking for the moment you could have swerved. When he finally did pick up the phone, it wasn't to call HR. "Grant," he said, when his head of security answered, "I need you to come up." What? Grant Mercer had been Riker's head of security for 9 years, and in that time he'd developed an instinct for the particular silence Riker fell into right before he asked for something he probably shouldn't. "What is it?" Grant said, settling into the chair across from the desk. He was a big man, ex-military, with a face that had been carved by more than one bad decade, and he wore his suits like they were uniforms he hadn't quite gotten used to. "Nora Ashcroft," Riker said. "How long has she worked here?" 6 years. Housekeeping staff. Clean background check, far as I remember. "Why?" "I want you to look again." Grant's eyebrows drew together. "Look again how?" "Deeper. School records, medical history, anything before she applied here. I want to know who she was before she was Nora Ashcroft." "She's been vetted, Riker. Twice, actually. Once when she was hired, once during the security upgrade 2 years back. Came back clean both times." "I know." Riker leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and for the first time Grant saw something in his employer's face that he didn't have a word for yet. Not suspicion, exactly. Something closer to recognition. "That's what bothers me." He told Grant about the hallway, the folders, the 3 seconds. Grant listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when Riker finished, he sat back and rubbed a thumb along his jaw. "You know what that sounds like," Grant said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Riker said. "I know exactly what that sounds like." "You want me to pull threads on a domestic abuse situation? That's a hell of a thing to go digging into without her consent. Could blow up the one stable thing she's got going." "I'm not trying to expose her," Riker said. "I need to know if she's safe. If there's someone out there who's still looking for her, a husband, an ex, whoever did that to her. I need to know before he shows up on my property and I find out the hard way that my security wasn't built to stop him." Grant studied him for a second. "That's a good cover story. Doesn't make it the real reason." Riker didn't answer that, and Grant didn't push. He'd worked for enough rich men to know the difference between curiosity and obsession, and he'd also worked for enough good ones to know that sometimes a man's conscience just got hooked on something and wouldn't let go until it understood why. "I'll need a few days," Grant said, standing. "I'm not going to lie to you and say it'll be clean. Whoever vetted her the first 2 times either did a sloppy job or what? Or somebody wanted her clean on paper." Grant paused at the door. Background checks don't usually come back spotless for people who flinch like that. People with histories like that have paper trails, Riker. Restraining orders, police reports, hospital visits that show up even when the women never press charges. A perfectly clean record on someone who reacts like she did, That's not the absence of a story. That's a story somebody went to a lot of trouble to erase. After Grant left, Riker sat alone in the dimming light of his office and thought about the way she'd said, "Thank you for asking, sir," in a voice so flat and so practiced it had sounded like a line from a script she'd memorized a long time ago and never stopped reciting. Nora finished The West Wing by noon, the way she'd promised, and ate her lunch alone in the small staff kitchen off the back hall, the way she always did, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple cut into slices because whole apples made too much noise when you bit them, and she'd never quite unlearned the instinct to eat quietly. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time she sat down. They always stopped, eventually. That was the thing about a body that had been broken in early and put back together wrong. It healed crooked, but it healed. The shaking would pass. The flush of humiliation creeping up her neck would pass. What wouldn't pass, what never passed, was the small, cold certainty sitting in her gut that something had shifted today, that she had been seen, really seen, for the first time in 6 years, and that being seen was the single most dangerous thing that could happen to a woman who'd spent 14 years making herself disappear. She thought about Gideon. She always thought about Gideon eventually, no matter how hard she tried not to. The way you can't stop your tongue from finding a chipped tooth. Gideon Ashcroft, with his soft voice and his expensive suits, the man who'd taught a 12-year-old that the worst monsters never raise their voices, that the ones who hurt you with a smile on their face are the ones you should fear the most, because the world will always believe the smile before it believes the bruise. She had been Lena Mercer once, a different last name, in a different life, in a different state, in a house that had burned down, figuratively, then literally, the night she watched something through a half-open basement door that 12-year-old eyes were never supposed to see. Men in good suits, money-changing hands, and then the part she still couldn't say out loud even in her own head, even after 14 years, even in the privacy of her own skull at 3 in the morning. The gun, the man on the floor, and Gideon standing over him with an expression of such calm, such untroubled, almost gentle calm, that it had taught her more about evil in 4 seconds than most people learn in a lifetime. They told her she'd be protected. The detectives, the social workers, the lawyers with their careful voices and their promises written on paper that turned out to mean nothing once the right amount of money exchanged the right number of hands. Within a year, the case had collapsed. Witnesses recanting, evidence lost, a key prosecutor suddenly transferred to a different district. And within 2 years, the people who were supposed to protect a 12-year-old witness had instead handed her quietly into the foster system under a sealed identity and let the whole thing die in a filing cabinet somewhere. She'd been Nora Ashcroft for 14 years now, longer than she'd ever been Lena Mercer. She barely remembered what it felt like to hear her real name spoken out loud by someone who meant it kindly. And now a billionaire with kind eyes and a hand that reached out a half-second too fast had looked at her like he'd seen straight through the 14 years of careful invisibility to the frightened child underneath. And something in her chest, something she'd kept locked so tightly for so long, she'd almost convinced herself it had died, had cracked open just enough to let a sliver of old terror back in. She finished her sandwich. She washed her plate. She went back to work because work was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. And somewhere in this house, a man was already pulling threads that, once pulled all the way, would unravel everything she'd built to survive. Grant Mercer worked fast, when he worked at all, and 4 days later he was back in Riker's office with a laptop and a face that told Riker the news wasn't going to be the kind that let anyone sleep easy. "I want to start by saying I followed every protocol," Grant said, settling into the chair, laptop open on his knee. "Nothing illegal, nothing that violates her rights. I just looked harder at what was already supposedly checked. Tell me." Nora Ashcroft's Social Security number was issued 19 years ago to a woman who's been dead since she was 3 months old. SIDS. Death, recorded in a small county in another state, never flagged because nobody cross-references infant deaths against adult identity issuances unless they're specifically looking for it. Grant turned the laptop so Riker could see the screen. Somebody built her a new identity using a dead baby's social, and they did it well. This isn't street-level forgery. This is the kind of identity construction that takes resources, connections, and most importantly, Motive. Riker felt something settle cold in his stomach. Keep going. I cross-referenced her physical description, approximate age, and the geographic patterns in her employment history against missing persons and cold case databases. It's not a perfect science, but I got a hit. Grant clicked to a new screen. An old newspaper scan, grainy, a school photo of a girl who couldn't have been older than 12, dark eyes, a guarded half-smile that looked like it had been coached into existing for the camera. Lena Mercer, reported missing 14 years ago, age 12, from a county about 600 miles from here. She was the sole witness in a homicide investigation tied to a financial corruption case, the kind that involved judges, a couple of state legislators, at least one law firm with ties to organized money laundering. The case collapsed about 18 months after she disappeared. No further mention of her in any public record, no death certificate, no reappearance under her own name. She just stopped existing. And you think, Nora, I think the resemblance is strong enough that I wouldn't bet against it, and I think the timeline lines up close enough to be more than coincidence. 12 years old, 14 years ago, makes her 26 when Nora Ashcroft first surfaces in employment records, which doesn't quite match Nora's stated age of 41, but Grant held up a hand before Riker could interrupt. People who build fake identities don't always get every detail perfect, especially identity age. If she was helped by people with limited resources at the time, a clumsy age adjustment is exactly the kind of mistake that slips through. I'm not saying it's confirmed, I'm saying it's the strongest lead I've got. And everything else about this case, the construction of the fake identity, the buried trail, the level of resources required, points towards someone with serious money and serious motive, making sure a witness from a corruption case never got found again. Riker stared at the school photo for a long time. Something about the eyes, guarded, too old for the face they belonged to, matched something he'd seen in a marble hallway 4 days ago, in the half-second before a grown woman folded into a child's brace against violence. There's one more thing, Grant said, and his voice had gone lower, more careful. While I was running searches, I tripped something, a flag. Not on our system, somewhere out there in the ether, the kind of thing you get when somebody's already running monitoring software on a name or an identity pattern and your search pings their alert system. Somebody else is looking for the same person, Riker, recently, actively, and they've got resources that make my search tools look like a toy. The room went very quiet. How recently? Riker said. Within the last month. Grant closed the laptop. Somebody started looking for her again, and now I just told them, indirectly, accidentally, that somebody else is looking too. That night, Riker didn't sleep. He sat in his study with the lights low, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk beside him, and turned the same question over and over in his mind, looking for an angle that didn't end with him making things worse for a woman who had clearly survived something by disappearing completely. Every instinct he had, every boardroom instinct, every instinct that had built him 3 companies and torn down 2 rivals who'd tried to bury him in litigation, told him to move fast, to bring in lawyers, to call federal contacts, to throw resources at the problem until it dissolved. That instinct had never failed him in business. But this wasn't business. This was a woman who had spent 14 years learning that the safest thing to do, always, was stay small and stay quiet and never let anyone get close enough to use her against herself. If he came at her with lawyers and federal contacts and a battalion of resources, he wouldn't be rescuing her. He'd be doing exactly what the men who hunted her had always done, deciding things about her life without asking her, treating her like a problem to be managed instead of a person who got to choose. So he did the only thing that felt right, even though every instinct screamed that it wasn't enough, that it was too small, too slow, too passive for the size of the danger Grant had just described. He wrote her a note. He sat at his desk for 40 minutes, drafting and discarding a dozen versions, throwing out anything that sounded like an accusation, anything that sounded like pity, anything that sounded like he was performing kindness instead of meaning it. In the end, the note he settled on was 4 lines long, written in his own hand because typed words felt too cold for what he was trying to say. Nora, I don't know your story, and you don't owe it to me. Whatever happened to you before you came here, it doesn't change how this house treats you. You're safe under this roof. No one will hurt you here. I mean that as a promise, not a question. R.A. He had it placed on her small desk in the staff quarters the next morning, folded once, her name written on the outside in careful block letters so there could be no mistake about who it was for. She found it before her first task of the day. She read it standing in the small windowless room that served as a break area for the household staff, and she read it twice. And on the second read, her hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. No one had ever written her something like that. Not once, not in 14 years, not even in the early days when social workers with kind faces had made promises about protection that turned to ash within a year. Promises from adults had always come with conditions, even when the adults themselves didn't realize they were attaching conditions. You're safe if you cooperate. You're safe if you stay quiet. You're safe if you don't make this harder than it needs to be. This note had no conditions. It didn't ask her for anything. It didn't even ask her to confirm or deny that there was anything to protect her from. It simply stated, flatly, like a fact about gravity, that she was safe. She folded the note back along its original crease and put it in the inside pocket of her uniform, against her chest, and went to work. And told herself it didn't mean anything, that kindness without a price tag was just kindness she hadn't yet discovered the cost of. She was wrong about a great many things in her life. She would turn out to be wrong about this too, though not in the way her fear was warning her. The text came 4 days later, on a Tuesday, while she was folding linens in the laundry room with the radio playing low in her mind for once in longer than she could remember, almost quiet. Her phone buzzed against the folding table, a number she didn't recognize. No name, no area code she could place at a glance. "We know exactly where you are." She read it once. Her hands didn't shake this time. They went perfectly, terribly still, the stillness of an animal that has just heard the specific sound that precedes a predator. The stillness that comes after fear has finished announcing itself and settled instead into something colder and more efficient. She read it a second time. Then she set the phone down on the folding table, very carefully, the way you set down something that might explode if jostled, and she stood there in the laundry room with a stack of warm towels in front of her, and the radio playing some song about young love that suddenly sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away, and she thought, with a clarity she hadn't felt in 14 years, "This is the moment. This is the moment I always knew would come." 14 years of running, 14 years of small rooms and false names and learning to flinch quietly, all of it had been building toward this single text message, 4 words long, sent by someone who hadn't even bothered to disguise the threat in politeness. Her first instinct, trained into her bones since she was 12 years old, was to run. Pack a bag tonight, leave before sunrise, become someone new in a city she'd never lived in, the way she'd done twice before in the years before Ravenshade Manor had felt safe enough to stay still in. Running was what had kept her alive. Running was the only strategy she trusted, because every other strategy, trusting institutions, trusting protections, trusting promises, had failed her catastrophically the one time she'd tried it, at 12 years old, in a courtroom that turned out to be made of paper-thin promises and men who could be bought. But something stopped her hand before she even picked the phone back up to start planning her exit. The note. Folded against her chest in the inside pocket of her uniform, 4 lines of handwriting that hadn't asked her for anything. "You're safe under this roof. I mean that as a promise, not a question." She didn't believe in promises. She'd built her entire survival around not believing in them. But she found herself standing very still in that laundry room, towel forgotten in her hands, thinking about a man who'd looked at her flinch and decided to investigate her safety instead of her employment file, who'd written her a note that asked for nothing in return, and for the first time in 14 years she let herself consider, just for a moment, the way you touch a stove you suspected might still be hot, the possibility that running wasn't actually her only option this time. She picked up the phone again and looked at the 4 words one more time. "We know exactly where you are." Then she walked out of the laundry room, down the back hallway, past the kitchen where the cook was prepping dinner and didn't look up, past the sitting room where a maid was dusting picture frames of dead Ashbourne men, and up the main staircase she almost never used, the one with the curved banister that led to the second-floor offices, and she did something she had not done in 14 years of careful, deliberate invisibility. She walked directly toward the one person whose attention she'd spent her whole life learning to avoid. She knocked on Riker Ashbourne's office door, and when he called for her to come in, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, and for several seconds she just stood there, back against the wood, like she needed it to hold her up. He rose from his desk immediately, alarm sharpening his face. Nora, what's wrong? She opened her mouth, and the words that came out weren't the ones she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in 14 years of imagining this exact confrontation. They were smaller and rawer, and they cracked in the middle like something breaking that had been holding its shape for far too long. My name isn't Nora, she said. It's Lena. Lena Mercer. And when I was 12 years old, I watched a man murder someone in a basement, and the people who were supposed to protect me afterward sold me out instead. And I think the same people just found out I'm still alive. The silence that followed felt like the entire house had stopped breathing. Riker came around the desk slowly, the way you'd approach something wounded and unpredictable, and stopped a careful distance away, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her. Sit down, he said quietly. Tell me everything. From the beginning, I'm not going anywhere, and neither is anyone else who matters in this house. Whoever sent you that message, because he could see it in her face, could see that something specific and recent had finally cracked the dam after 6 years of perfect silence. They don't get to decide what happens next. Not anymore. Not while I have a say in it. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she'd searched 1,000 faces over 14 years for the lie. Underneath the kindness, the condition underneath the promise, the price tag underneath the gift. She didn't find one. So for the first time since she was 12 years old, standing in a basement doorway with her whole future about to be stolen from her, Lena Mercer sat down across from a man who had decided, without being asked, to fight for her. And she began finally, after 14 years of silence, to tell the truth. She had no way of knowing, as the words finally started coming, that somewhere across the country a phone was already ringing in the office of a man named Gideon Ashcroft, and that the voice on the other end was about to tell him the one thing he'd spent 14 years believing was impossible. The witness was alive, and this time she wasn't alone. She talked for 2 hours. It came out of her in pieces, not a clean narrative, but something closer to wreckage washing up on a beach. A fragment here, a fragment there, none of it in order, all of it true. Riker didn't take notes. He didn't interrupt. He sat across from her with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together so tight his knuckles had gone pale, and he listened to a woman describe watching a man die through a half-open door when she was 12 years old. And he understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that he had never actually known what fear sounded like until he heard it dressed up as calm. By the time she finished, the light outside the window had shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening, and neither of them had moved to turn on a lamp. Say his name again, Riker said. Gideon Ashcroft. You took his last name. They gave it to me. Her voice was hoarse now, scraped thin from talking longer than she had in 14 years combined. The placement agency that built my new identity used a name pool, and Ashcroft was on the list. I didn't pick it. I didn't even notice the irony until I'd already been Nora Ashcroft for 2 years. By then it felt like too much trouble to change again. That's not irony. That's a mistake somebody made that could have gotten you killed. Maybe. She looked at her hands. Or maybe nobody making fake identities for scared kids in a rushed federal program, double checks against the actual conspirators' last names. I don't know. I stopped trying to make sense of how broken the system was a long time ago. It just was. Riker stood up, paced to the window, came back. He was a man built for solving problems with capital and leverage, and right now he had a surplus of both and nowhere yet to point them. I want to bring in Grant, he said, officially this time, and I want to bring in someone else, Vivian Rhodes. She's done cyber forensics work for 2 of my companies, the kind of digital archaeology that finds things people thought they'd buried. If there's a paper trail left anywhere, financial records, sealed court documents, anything, she can find threads other people miss. You're moving fast. You came to me with a text message that said someone knows exactly where you are. I don't think slow is the right speed for this. Slow has kept me alive for 14 years. And it just failed. He said it bluntly, not cruelly, but the bluntness still landed like a slap, and he saw her flinch. Not the violent flinch from the hallway, something quieter, more controlled, but a flinch all the same. He exhaled. I'm sorry. That came out wrong. No, she said. It came out right. That's the problem. Grant Mercer arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a single text from Riker that read, Conference room, now, bring everything you've got on the Mercer case. He walked in already mid-stride, already talking. I pulled the flag data again before I came up. Whoever's monitoring activity related to her identity isn't some local PI working a tip. The digital footprint behind that search alert routes through at least 2 shell entities before it hits anything traceable, and one of those entities has a registered agent that's connected. Distantly, but connected to a law firm in the Mercer case files. Same firm that represented 2 of the men named in the original corruption indictment 14 years ago. He stopped when he saw Nora sitting at the conference table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "You told her," Grant said to Riker. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but it wasn't far off either. "She told me," Riker said. Grant looked at Nora for a long moment, recalibrating. "Lena Mercer." "You knew already," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd watched his face when he said it. There'd been no surprise in it, only confirmation. "I had a strong suspicion 4 days ago. Riker, I should have told you the second I found the photo match instead of waiting to build the whole case file first." "You were trying to be thorough," Riker said. "I was trying to be right before I dropped a 14-year-old trauma on a man's desk." Grant's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is that whoever's looking for her has resources that make my search software look like a toy, and they've had a month's head start while I was busy being careful." "A month," Nora repeated. Something cold moved behind her eyes. "You said the flag was tripped within the last month. That's before I ever even bumped into him in that hallway." The room went quiet. "Meaning what?" Riker said slowly. "Meaning somebody started looking for me before any of this happened. Before the cart. Before the note. This isn't about you finding me, Riker. Somebody else found me first, and your search just walked right into their tripwire and told them somebody new was sniffing around too." She set the mug down with a click that was louder than she intended. "You didn't protect me. You exposed me. That's not fair. Fair has nothing to do with it. I've kept myself alive for 14 years by staying small enough that nobody's search software ever pinged anything. 6 days ago, you decided my privacy was a problem you were entitled to solve. And now there's a digital flag with both our names tangled up in it, sitting in a database owned by people connected to the men who murdered a witness in front of me when I was 12. Riker's face went still in a way Grant recognized. The look of a man absorbing a hit he hadn't seen coming, in a sparring match he hadn't agreed to enter. "I was trying to keep you safe. You don't get to decide what keeps me safe. Nobody ever asks me what keeps me safe. They just decide, and then I'm the one who has to live with what they decided." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated that it cracked, hated that 14 years of discipline had a crack in it after all, right here, in front of 2 men who'd known her real name for less than an hour combined. "You should have left it alone. If I'd left it alone, you'd still be flinching every time someone reaches toward you, and I'd still be telling myself it was none of my business." "It wasn't your business. It became my business the second you collapsed in my hallway, like you were waiting to be beaten." His voice rose, not loud, but sharp, the first real edge she'd heard from him since they'd met. "I don't regret looking. I regret that looking apparently has consequences I didn't anticipate, but I will not sit here and apologize for refusing to pretend I didn't see what I saw." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one whose life just got more dangerous because somebody got curious. Both of you, stop." Grant's voice cut through it, flat and hard, the voice of a man who'd spent 9 years keeping volatile rooms from catching fire. "This is exactly the kind of noise that gets people killed. Not the digital flag, this. 2 people pointing fingers about whose fault it is while the actual threat keeps moving. I don't care who's right. I care what we do in the next 24 hours. Silence settled, brittle and uncomfortable. Nora looked away first, toward the window, toward the dark gardens she'd swept and weeded 100 times without ever once feeling unsafe in them. Until now. "What do we do?" she said finally, quieter. "We figure out who's actually behind the monitoring," Grant said. "Not assumptions, confirmed identity. And we figure out whether they know it's you specifically, or whether they're just running a wide net on old case names and you happen to surface in it. And if it's specifically me, then we have considerably less time than I'd like." Vivian Rhodes arrived the next morning carrying 2 laptops, a portable hard drive case, and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd clearly worked through the night already on something else entirely. She was younger than Nora expected. Early 30s, sharp-eyed, The kind of person who looked at a room and immediately started cataloging its exits. "Riker," she said by way of greeting, dropping her bags on the conference table without ceremony. "You said this was urgent. You didn't say it was this." She glanced at Nora. "I read the brief Grant sent over. I'm sorry. That's an ugly thing to carry alone for 14 years. "I wasn't carrying it alone," Nora said, more sharply than she meant to. "I was carrying it quietly. Those aren't the same thing, and right now I'm regretting that the difference stopped mattering." Vivian didn't flinch from the tone. She just nodded, like she understood exactly what kind of morning this was going to be, and opened her first laptop. "Okay, let's get to work, because the faster we understand what we're dealing with, the faster we can stop arguing about whose fault it is and start arguing about something useful." For 3 hours, the conference room filled with the low hum of servers and the clatter of keys. Vivian worked through layers of shell registrations with the patience of a surgeon, narrating occasionally in fragments. "That's a Delaware holding company. Dead end. Registered agents, just a mail drop. This one's interesting. This one roots back through a financial services entity that's been flagged twice for compliance violations and never prosecuted it." While Grant cross-referenced names against the old case files he'd dug up from public archives and sealed record summaries that had leaked into journalism databases over the years, Riker mostly watched. He'd offered, twice, to help with something technical, and twice Vivian had told him, not unkindly, that he'd be more useful staying out of the way and ordering food, which told him everything he needed to know about how much actual expertise he brought to this particular fight. Nora sat at the end of the table, arms crossed, watching 3 strangers. 2 of them strangers until this week. One of them a man she'd worked for silently for 6 years, dig through the wreckage of her childhood like archaeologists at a dig site. It should have felt violating. In some ways it did, but there was also something strange and unfamiliar happening in her chest. Something she didn't have a name for yet, watching people spend their time and their skill on the specific project of keeping her alive. It had been a long time since anyone had spent anything on her at all. "Got something," Vivian said, around hour 3, and the room went still. "The entity that tripped Grant's search. It's a compliance and risk management consultancy." Sounds boring. Most shell structures are designed to sound boring, but the registered agent's name shows up on 3 other filings, and one of those filings is for a private legal trust that— She paused, scrolling, her face changing. "That's connected to a charitable foundation." "Which foundation?" Riker said. Vivian looked up at him with an expression that made the room's temperature drop several degrees before she even answered. "The Ashbourne Family Foundation." For a moment, nobody spoke. Riker's face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from blood leaving it too fast. "That's not possible," he said. "I'm telling you what the filing says. My father's foundation has been dormant for 6 years. It doesn't fund anything. It doesn't do anything. It's a tax structure my lawyers maintain because dissolving it costs more than leaving it open." "Dormant doesn't mean empty," Vivian said carefully. "Foundations like that can sit quiet for years while still being used as a financial pass-through. I'm not saying your father's foundation is the source of the threat against Lena. I'm saying there's a documented connection between the entity monitoring her identity and a trust structure tied to your family's name, and that connection existed before any of us started looking." "Before," Riker repeated, "meaning it's been there the whole time. Meaning your search and Grant's search didn't create this connection. You just found it." Nora's eyes moved slowly from Vivian to Riker, and something in her expression had shifted. Not softened, the opposite. Something narrowing, sharpening, the particular wariness of someone recalculating who, exactly, was sitting across the table from her. "Your family's foundation," she said quietly. "I had no idea." "That's what everyone says. Every single time. The judges said they had no idea. The prosecutor who got transferred said it was a coincidence. The social worker who placed me with my second foster family said she had no idea that family had financial ties to the firm representing one of the men I watched commit murder." Everyone always has no idea, Riker, right up until the moment the money trail leads straight back to their own front door. "I'm not them." "You don't know that yet. Neither do I." Her voice had gone cold in a way that hadn't been there an hour ago, 14 years of learned suspicion reasserting itself with brutal efficiency. "I told you the truth in your office yesterday because you wrote me a note that didn't ask for anything, and because for one stupid, exhausted moment, I let myself believe that meant something." But I've spent my entire life watching kind faces turn out to be connected to the exact people who hurt me. And right now I am sitting in a room being told that the man who decided to dig into my past has a family foundation tangled up in the same financial network as the people hunting me down. Then let's find out exactly what that connection is, Riker said, and his voice had an edge now too, frustration and hurt braided together. Instead of deciding right now, with half the information, that I'm one of them. That's easy for you to say. You get to sit here and ask me to extend trust on credit. I don't have credit to extend. I spent it all 14 years ago and I never got it back. Grant cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to say something nobody in the room wanted to hear. For what it's worth, and I know this isn't comforting right now, the foundation connection might explain something else. The original case, 14 years ago. The collapse happened fast. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, a prosecutor got moved. That kind of coordinated collapse doesn't happen on local resources. It happens when somebody with serious capital and serious legal infrastructure decides a problem needs to disappear. If there's an old financial structure that's been quietly servicing that kind of cleanup for 14 years or more, then it didn't start with me, Riker said slowly, putting it together even as the words left his mouth, even as he could feel the floor of his own family history tilting under him. It started before me. Possibly before I was even running the company. My father, he stopped. Nora watched him stop, watched the particular kind of horror move across his face that she recognized because she'd worn it herself 14 years ago. The horror of realizing the ground you'd been standing on your whole life was never solid to begin with. Your father, she said. Died 9 years ago, Riker said, voice flat now, working hard to stay level. Heart failure. I inherited the company, the house, the foundation, all of it. And I never once audited the foundation's older financial records because there was no reason to. It was dormant. It had been dormant since before he died, as far as I knew. He looked at Vivian. How far back do those filings go? I'd need more time to pull the full history. Pull it, tonight. I don't care what it costs or how many people you need to call in. Riker. Grant's voice was careful now, the voice of a man trying to slow down a freight train that had already left the station. If this goes where I think it might go, you need to understand what you're about to find. This isn't going to be a clean story where your father was a victim of circumstance. The pattern Vivian's describing, financial structures used to fund witness suppression, evidence destruction, prosecutorial interference, that's not passive. That's active, ongoing, expensive work. If your family's foundation has been connected to that for over a decade, somebody in your family knew. Maybe still knows. Are you suggesting my father had something to do with what happened to her? I'm suggesting you need to be ready for the possibility before you go digging further, because once you know, you can't unknow it. And there's no version of this where you find out your father funded the silencing of a child witness, and it doesn't change how you understand every memory you have of him. The room had gone very quiet. Nora was watching Riker with an expression that had stopped being purely defensive and started becoming something more complicated. Pity, almost, underneath the suspicion, because she recognized the specific shape of what was happening to him. She'd lived inside that particular collapse once. The world you thought you understood turning out to have a trap door in the floor the whole time. I need to know, Riker said. Whatever it is. I'm not going to protect a dead man's reputation at the cost of a living woman's safety. That's a nice thing to say right now, Nora said. Let's see if it's still true once you actually find out. Is that a threat? It's a prediction. Based on 14 years of watching people's principles get a lot more flexible once the truth starts costing them something personal. I've already lost my own father's good name in the last 10 minutes, and I haven't even confirmed anything yet. Riker snapped, the first time his voice had genuinely risen since she'd walked into his office the day before. Forgive me if I don't have a rehearsed speech ready about exactly how unshakable my commitment to you is going to remain once I find out the worst of it. I'm telling you what I know to be true right now, which is that I am not going to stop looking, and I'm not going to ask you to trust me on faith. I'm asking you to watch what I actually do. Nora held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them that wasn't quite resolution and wasn't quite forgiveness either. More like a temporary, fragile truce, the kind two exhausted people negotiate not because they've solved anything, but because the alternative is collapsing entirely. and neither of them can afford to collapse yet. Fine, she said. Watch is exactly what I'm going to do. That. Vivian worked through the night. By 4 in the morning, she had pulled records going back 11 years. Financial statements, board minutes, grant disbursements that didn't match any publicly listed charitable activity, wire transfers routed through the same compliance consultancy that had tripped Grant's search alert. The pattern that emerged wasn't subtle once you knew what you were looking for. Money moving from the Ashbourne Family Foundation into legal defense funds for men who, on paper, had nothing to do with the foundation's stated charitable mission. Payments to a consulting fee line item that activated, with suspicious regularity, in the months immediately following major court filings in cases that had nothing to do with philanthropy. And buried in a disbursement log from 14 years and 2 months ago, 1 month before a 12-year-old girl named Lena Mercer watched a man die in a basement. A single wire transfer, 6 figures, routed to an account associated with the same law firm that had represented 2 of the men in the original corruption indictment. Vivian printed the page. She didn't show it to anyone yet. She sat alone in the conference room at 4:30 in the morning with the house silent around her and stared at a 6-figure number that connected, with cold mathematical certainty, the family whose name was on the front gate to the conspiracy that had stolen a child's entire life. She thought about waking Riker immediately. She decided instead to wait until morning because some truths deserved daylight, and because she suspected, correctly as it turned out, that the moment she put this page in front of him, nothing in this house was going to be simple again. She was still sitting there, coffee gone cold beside her, when the first gray light started touching the windows, and somewhere on the other side of the country, in an office with leather chairs and a view of a city skyline, Gideon Ashcroft hung up a phone call that had lasted 4 minutes and told him everything he needed to know. The witness was alive, the witness was talking, and the witness was sitting inside a house that, it turned out, his own financial network had been quietly servicing for over a decade, which meant that whatever Riker Ashbourne thought he was protecting, Gideon already had a foothold inside it. He picked up a second phone. This one had no name attached to its contact, only a string of numbers he'd used exactly 4 times in 14 years, each time for something that could not be allowed to surface. "It's confirmed," he said when the line connected. "She's alive. She's talking. And I need it handled before she finishes the sentence she started." There was a pause on the other end, and then a single word in response. Flat, unhurried, the voice of someone for whom this kind of request was simply Tuesday. "Understood." Gideon ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, looking at the city lights below, and felt nothing that resembled fear. 14 years of practice had taught him that fear was a luxury for people who hadn't yet learned how easily the truth could be made to disappear. He had buried one inconvenient truth already. He intended to bury this one just as completely. And this time he intended to make sure it stayed buried for good. Vivian was still in the conference room when Riker came down at 6 in the morning, unshaven, moving like a man who hadn't slept and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. She didn't say good morning. She just slid the printed page across the table toward him without a word and watched his face while he read it. He read it twice. She could tell, because his eyes went back to the top of the page the same way Nora's had gone back over the text message 2 days earlier. The specific stillness of someone rereading a sentence hoping the second pass might change what the first pass said. 6 figures, he said finally. 1 month before. 1 month before, Vivian confirmed. Wired to an account tied to the law firm representing 2 of the men named in the original indictment. I cross-checked the dates against the public court calendar from that period. The transfer landed 9 days before a pretrial hearing that ultimately got postponed twice and then quietly dismissed for lack of witness cooperation. My father signed off on foundation disbursements personally. Every transfer over $50,000 needed his signature. I know. I found it. She turned to the second page where a scanned signature sat at the bottom of an authorization form, dated, notarized, unmistakable. Riker Ashbourne's father's name, in his own hand, approving a payment that had helped bury a 12-year-old witness to murder. Riker set the page down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might detonate if it touches the table wrong, and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a long time. "Say something," Vivian said. "I don't have anything to say yet that isn't going to sound like an excuse." "Then don't say anything. Just decide what you're going to do." Behind him, the door opened, and he didn't need to turn around to know it was Nora. He could feel it in the way the air in the room changed, the particular alertness that came into a space whenever she entered it, a woman permanently scanning for exits even in houses she'd lived in for years. "Grant told me you found something," she said. "He wouldn't tell me what." Riker turned around. He looked for a moment like a man choosing between two kinds of cowardice, hiding the truth to protect himself or hiding it to protect her from one more wound, and then visibly deciding that both options were unforgivable and that the only thing left was honesty, however much it cost. "My father funded part of it," he said. "Not the murder, not directly, but the cleanup afterward, the law firm, the witness intimidation, possibly the collapse of the case itself. There's a wire transfer with his signature on it, dated a month before the hearing that got dismissed." The room went very still. Nora didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't do any of the things a person was supposed to do when handed information like that. She just stood in the doorway, very straight, very quiet, and looked at him with an expression that had gone somewhere flat and far away. The particular blankness of someone whose body had decided, independently of her permission, to stop feeling anything at all because feeling it fully might break something irreparable. "Say it again," she said. "Nora, say it again, slowly. I want to hear exactly how you phrase it. My father's foundation funded the legal effort that suppressed the case against the men who killed someone in front of you. There's documentation, a signed authorization. It happened a month before your hearing got dismissed." He made himself hold her gaze while he said it, even though every instinct told him to look away, to soften it, to find some gentler architecture for the sentence. "I'm not going to lie to you about what I found, even though I know exactly what it sounds like coming out of my mouth right now. It sounds," she said very quietly, "like every single thing I have ever believed about you for the last 6 years was a story you were telling without even knowing you were telling it." "I didn't know." "You keep saying that like it changes the math." Her voice was rising now, not loud, but cracking at the edges, the careful control of 14 years starting to come apart in real time. "I have spent 6 years cleaning your floors and emptying your trash and calling you sir in a house your family bought, partly with money laundered through the exact conspiracy that destroyed my entire childhood. Do you understand how that sounds? Do you understand what it does to a person to find out the safest place they've ever lived was paid for, in part, by the same poison that put them there in the first place? I understand it's the worst thing you could possibly hear from me right now. You don't understand anything. You can't. You've never had to." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second, hard, like she was physically holding something in, and when she dropped it, her eyes were wet, but her voice had gone cold and controlled again, the 14-year-old discipline reasserting itself by sheer force of will. "I need to leave." "Nora, that's the last thing—" "Don't." The word came out like a slap. "Don't tell me what the last thing I should do is. You have spent 6 days deciding what's best for me without asking, and look where that's gotten us. Your father's money helped bury my life. I am not staying in this house another night pretending that detail doesn't change everything." Grant had appeared in the doorway behind her at some point during the exchange, drawn by the rising volume, and he stepped in now with the careful authority of a man who'd diffused worse situations than this one, though not by much. "If you run right now," he said, "you run into exactly the threat you came here trying to survive. We don't know who 'handled' means yet, but Gideon Ashcroft has had 4 days to mobilize since that text message went out. And the second you're outside this property's security perimeter, you're a woman alone with no protection and a target on her back the size of a billboard. So I'm trapped," Nora said. "Either I stay in a house funded by the people who ruined me, or I walk outside and get killed by the same people. That's the choice you're giving me." "That's not the choice I'm giving you," Riker said. "That's the situation. I didn't create it. I just found out about it an hour before you did. You found out about it because you decided to go digging into my past without asking me first. None of this happens if you just let me keep mopping your floors in peace. Then you'd still be flinching every time someone got within 3 feet of you, and somewhere out there, a man who spent 14 years thinking you were dead would have eventually found out you weren't, with or without my help, and you'd have had no idea it was coming. At least now you know. At least now you have people in this room who are actually trying to stop it. People in this room whose family helped cause it. Yes." He said it without flinching, without softening it, because there was no version of softening it that wouldn't be a lie. And I'm going to spend every resource I have on doing that, starting today, whether you ever forgive me for it or not. That's not a negotiation. That's just what's going to happen. Nora stared at him, breathing hard, and for a moment the room held the particular electric silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them had a map for. "Prove it," she said finally. "How?" "Find out everything. Not just the wire transfer, all of it. Every dollar, every name, every judge and lawyer and politician your father's money ever touched. Then take it public. Not quietly. Not through some controlled settlement that makes your family's name disappear from the headlines while everyone involved walks away with their pensions intact. Publicly. Completely. Even if it means burning down everything your name is attached to. Done. You're agreeing before you even understand what that would cost you. I understand exactly what it would cost me. My reputation, possibly the company. Definitely whatever's left of how I thought about my father." He said it steadily, no hesitation, the words of a man who'd already done the math somewhere in the back of his mind during the long minute he'd spent staring out the window. "It's still less than what it's already cost you." Something in Nora's face shifted then. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall she'd been holding up since the moment Vivian's printout hit the table. She didn't say anything else. She just nodded, once, sharp, and turned and walked out of the room. And nobody followed her, because everybody in that room understood, without needing to discuss it, that she needed 30 seconds alone before she came apart in front of an audience. She found the small, chapel-less quiet of the back garden instead, sat on a stone bench beneath a magnolia tree that wasn't yet in bloom, and put her face in her hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry without trying to be quiet about it. It didn't last long. It never did. 14 years of discipline didn't undo itself in 5 minutes, just because the dam had finally cracked. But for those few minutes, in a garden she'd weeded 100 times without ever once crying in it, she let the full weight of the betrayal move through her. Not just Riker's father's money, but the cumulative weight of every adult who had ever promised to protect her and then either failed or, worse, turned out to be quietly profiting from her destruction the entire time. She didn't hear Grant approach until he was already close, his footsteps deliberately loud on the gravel path, the courtesy of a man who understood that sneaking up on her, even by accident, would not go well for anyone. "Mind if I sit?" he said. She didn't answer, which he correctly interpreted as permission. He sat on the far end of the bench, leaving a careful 3 feet between them, and for a while neither of them said anything. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, "and I need you to let me finish before you react because it's going to sound bad before it sounds like anything useful." Something in his tone made her lift her head. "My last name is Mercer," he said. She went very still. "It's a common enough name. I want to say that first because I know exactly what you're thinking, and I need you to actually hear the rest before you decide it's a coincidence or it isn't." He kept his eyes forward, on the garden, not on her, giving her room. "I grew up about 400 miles from where your case happened. I had an aunt on my father's side, older than my dad by a decade, lived 2 states over, we weren't close, saw her maybe twice a year when I was a kid. She had a daughter, my cousin. The family lost touch with that whole branch when I was about 10. After some kind of falling out nobody ever explained to me. I always assumed it was money or politics or the usual ugly family stuff that nobody talks about at dinner." Nora's breathing had changed, shallow, fast, the sound of someone bracing for something before they even know what it is. "I didn't put it together until Riker told me your real name 4 days ago," Grant said. "Lena Mercer. I ran the name because that's my job, and I found the same case file you'd expect, child. The corruption case, the homicide, the missing witness, and somewhere in the old county records, before everything got sealed, there's a family tree document from a custody hearing that predates all of it. Your mother's maiden name is on that document." He finally turned to look at her. "I think your mother might have been my cousin." The silence that followed felt enormous, like the garden itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. "You're telling me," Nora said very slowly, each word placed like she was walking across ice, "that you might be my family. I'm telling you I might be the only blood relative you have left who isn't either dead or complicit in what happened to you. And I'm telling you, I didn't say anything until now because I needed to be sure before I handed you one more uncertain thing to carry, on top of everything else this week has already handed you." She stared at him. 14 years of being utterly, completely alone. No family, no real name, no one who remembered her as anything other than a careful fiction she'd built to survive. And now, in the same week that had already burned down half of what she thought she understood about safety, a stranger with a security earpiece and an ex-military bearing was telling her she might have an actual blood connection sitting 4 feet away on a garden bench. "Why now?" she said. "Why tell me now, in the middle of everything else? Because if I'm right, it changes something important. It means the people hunting you might not be the only ones with a personal stake in this. It means I have more reason than a paycheck to make sure you walk out of this alive. And because..." He hesitated, the first hesitation she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Because you just got handed proof that the man you work for inherited a legacy of betrayal, and I didn't want you to go one more hour thinking every single person in this house was connected to that legacy and nobody else. You're not as alone as you think you are. That's the whole reason I'm telling you, not to add weight, to take some off." She didn't know what to do with that. 14 years had trained her to treat every unexpected kindness as a delayed cost, every revelation as a potential trap, and some animal part of her brain was already searching Grant's calm, careful face for the angle, the catch, the thing he wanted in return. She found nothing. Just a tired man on a garden bench telling her the truth at the worst possible moment, because he'd judged, correctly, that she needed it more than she needed convenience. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted. "You don't have to do anything with it right now. Just know it's there." He stood, brushing off his slacks, putting the careful distance back between them that he'd maintained the whole conversation. "We'll run a real test if you want. DNA, paperwork, whatever makes it concrete instead of a guess. But I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from anyone else. And I wanted you to hear it today, because today is the day you needed it most." He left her alone in the garden after that, and she sat beneath the bare magnolia for a long time, turning over the strange new shape of a world that had, in the span of one single week, both collapsed and expanded at the same time. The foundation she'd trusted revealed as rotten, and a family she didn't know she had surfacing out of the wreckage like something pushing up through ash. By that evening, the house had reorganized itself into something resembling a war room. Vivian had commandeered the entire east end of the second floor, 3 monitors now running instead of 2 laptops, financial records spread across every available surface, color-coded tabs marking transactions she'd traced back nearly 15 years. Grant had brought in 2 additional security personnel he trusted personally, men who'd served with him and who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Riker had spent 4 hours on the phone with lawyers, drafting language for what would eventually become a public disclosure, each version more exposed and less protective of his family's name than the last, because every time his legal team tried to soften it, he made them sharpen it back up again. It was nearly 9 that night when Vivian called everyone back to the conference room, her face drawn tight in a way that made the room go quiet before she'd said a word. "I found the transport schedule," she said. "What transport schedule?" Riker asked. "The original case evidence. 14 years ago, when the case collapsed, not everything got destroyed. Some of it got sealed and transferred to a federal evidence facility instead, the kind of material that's too significant to outright destroy without raising flags, so it gets buried in storage instead and quietly forgotten." She turned her laptop toward the room. "I found a digital trace of a request, filed 11 days ago, before any of this started, before the text message, before Grant's search, requesting an expedited destruction order for a sealed evidence batch tied to a case number that matches your file, Nora. Lena. Whatever you want me to call you right now." "Destruction order," Nora repeated. "Government records facilities don't destroy sealed evidence on a whim. It takes paperwork, justification, usually a court order or an administrative ruling that the material's no longer relevant to any active investigation. Someone with serious legal reach got that order approved fast and quietly, and the disposal is scheduled." Vivian's finger hovered over the screen for a second before she finished. "At dawn, tomorrow morning, a transport convoy moves the remaining physical evidence to a facility 200 miles from here for what's officially logged as routine disposal. That's the only evidence that still exists," Nora said. her voice gone thin. Everything else got destroyed or buried 14 years ago. If that transport happens, then there's no case left to make, Grant finished. No matter what we find in the financial records, no matter what Vivian's traced, no matter what Riker's willing to expose about his own family, without that physical evidence, it's allegations against men with enough money and enough lawyers to bury allegations the way they buried the first case. We have less than 9 hours. Riker was already moving, already pulling out his phone, his mind racing through every contact, every favor, every lever he could pull in less time than it would take most people to finish a cup of coffee. "Where's the transport originating?" he said. "Exact route, exact timing. I need everything." "Working on it," Vivian said, fingers already flying. "But Riker, even if we get the route, even if we know exactly where that convoy is at dawn, we don't have legal authority to intercept a federal evidence transfer. What you're talking about isn't a phone call to a judge, it's, I know what it is. Do you? Because what you're describing isn't a lawsuit. It's putting yourself and everyone in this room directly in the path of a moving target with armed federal contractors, on the say of a man who's already proven he's willing to bury a 12-year-old witness to protect himself. If we go after that evidence ourselves, there's no controlled version of this. There's no clean outcome." Nora stood up from the table, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the brittle edge from the garden and the conference room confrontation, replaced by something flatter, harder. The voice of someone who had just run out of any version of this story that didn't require her to step directly into the fire. "Then we stop talking about whether it's safe," she said, "and we start talking about how we get there before sunrise. Because if that evidence disappears tomorrow morning, everything we've found in the last 6 days, the money trail, the wire transfers, your father's signature, all of it, becomes nothing but a story nobody with power will ever be forced to answer for. I have spent 14 years letting other people decide the timeline of my own survival. I am not doing that again. Not tonight." The room fell silent, the weight of what she was proposing settling over all of them at once. The certainty that within 9 hours every person in that room would either be standing in the wreckage of a conspiracy finally exposed or standing nowhere at all, because there would be no second chance once that convoy reached its destination. Outside, the first edge of a storm front was rolling in from the west, clouds stacking dark against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be night or morning. And somewhere on a stretch of highway none of them had seen yet, a transport convoy was already being loaded, crates sealed, paperwork signed, drivers briefed on a route and a timeline that had been designed deliberately to make absolutely certain that whatever truth those crates contained would never see daylight again. They moved before midnight. Grant assembled his 2 trusted men in the garage while Vivian fed live coordinates from a tracking ping she'd managed to plant, illegally, she admitted flatly, on the transport company's dispatch system, into a tablet mounted on the dash of the lead vehicle. Riker drove the second car himself, knuckles white on the wheel, because he'd refused, point blank, to be anywhere but the front of this when it happened. Nora sat beside him in the passenger seat, a borrowed tactical vest 2 sizes too big cinched tight across her chest, and she did not look like a woman who'd spent 6 years pushing a housekeeping cart through marble hallways. She looked like someone who had finally stopped running and started moving toward the thing chasing her instead. And there was something in her face that hadn't been there 4 days ago. Not fearlessness, she was plenty afraid. Her hand shook every time the car hit a pothole, but something underneath the fear that had calcified into pure, cold purpose. "You don't have to be in this car," Riker said, eyes on the road, rain already starting to streak the windshield in long, gray lines. "I'm not asking permission. I told you that already." "I know, I'm saying it anyway." "Then say something useful instead." Her voice was tight, controlled, each word bitten off short. "Tell me what happens if we're wrong about the route." "We're not wrong." Vivian confirmed it twice. "Tell me anyway." He understood then that she wasn't actually asking about the route. She needed him talking, needed the sound of a voice filling the car so the silence didn't fill it. Instead, with every memory her body was currently flooding her with, a basement, a gun, a calm voice telling a frightened child that some things were simply not meant to be seen. He kept talking, about the route, about Grant's contingency plans, about anything, his voice low and steady against the rain hammering the glass, until the dashboard clock ticked past 4:30, and Vivian's voice crackled through the radio. "Convoy's 2 miles ahead holding speed. You're coming up on the rendezvous point now. Storm's getting worse. Visibility's dropping fast, which helps us and them in equal measure. Copy, Grant said from the lead car. Positions on my mark. The highway here cut through open farmland, 2 lanes each direction with nothing but black fields and the occasional skeletal silhouette of a grain silo on either side. No lighting except what the vehicles carried themselves. Rain came down in sheets now, hard enough that the wipers couldn't keep up, hard enough that the world outside the windshield dissolved into smeared gray streaks of headlight and storm. Then the convoy's lights appeared ahead. 2 armored transport vans, a lead security vehicle, a trailing one, moving in tight formation at exactly the speed limit. The disciplined caution of professionals who'd done this exact job 100 times and had no reason to expect tonight would be different. Grant's voice came through the radio, flat and final. Mark. 3 vehicles peeled out from the shoulder where they'd been waiting, dark and lightless, and angled hard across both lanes of the highway in a coordinated block that gave the convoy no room to swerve around and no room to stop safely either. Brakes screamed. Headlights swung wild across the rain-slicked asphalt. The lead security vehicle fishtailed, overcorrected, and came to a shuddering stop at an angle, nose pointed off the road entirely, while the 2 transport vans behind it braked hard enough that Riker heard the tires shriek even through his closed window 30 yards away. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Just rain hammering metal, headlights crossing at broken angles, the engine of every vehicle still running, exhaust steaming up into the storm. Then the doors of the security vehicles opened, and men came out fast, weapons already up, the practiced speed of contractors who trained for exactly this scenario, even if they'd never actually expected to use the training. "Stay in the car," Riker said. "Like hell." Nora was already unbuckling. Nora. They're not going to shoot a woman walking toward them with her hands visible. They might shoot a man who looks like he's running this operation. I have a better chance out there than you do right now, and we both know it. He didn't have time to argue, because Grant was already out of the lead vehicle, hands raised, shouting something into the rain that Riker couldn't fully hear over the storm. Words about federal evidence, about chain of custody violations, about a court order that didn't actually exist yet, but might exist within the hour if everyone just gave them 10 minutes. It didn't work. It was never going to work. 6 contractors with rifles didn't care about chains of custody. They cared about the orders they'd been given, and the orders they'd been given said, "Protect the cargo, whatever that takes." A shot cracked through the rain, not aimed at anyone, a warning round into the wet asphalt that sent a spray of grit and water into the air, and every person on that stretch of highway went still for the length of one held breath. Then the back doors of a black sedan that had been idling 50 yards behind the convoy the entire time, lights off, invisible until this exact moment, opened, and a man stepped out into the storm without an umbrella, without hurrying, as if rain were beneath his concern entirely. Gideon Ashcroft looked exactly like the kind of man who'd spent 14 years bearing truth for a living. Mid-60s, silver hair slicked flat against the rain, a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a face arranged into an expression of mild, almost bureaucratic patience, as if this entire confrontation were a scheduling inconvenience rather than the collapse of everything he'd spent his life protecting. "Lena," he said, and his voice carried easily over the rain, calm in a way that made the hair on the back of Riker's neck stand up. "You've gotten taller." Nora, Lena, stopped walking. Riker watched her spine go rigid, watched 14 years of careful discipline war visibly with something far older and far more primitive, the body remembering a basement and a gun and a voice, exactly this calm telling her gently that some things simply weren't meant to be seen. "You're real," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "I used to think I made you bigger than you actually were. In my head. I used to think no one could actually be as calm as I remembered you being while a man bled out on the floor in front of you." "I was very calm," Gideon agreed pleasantly, as if confirming a minor detail about the weather. "Panic is what gets people caught. I've never panicked in my life. It served me well." He glanced past her, to Riker, to Grant, to the armed contractors still holding position around the stalled convoy. "Mr. Ashbourne, I have to admit, I didn't expect you specifically to be involved in this. Your father and I had a very productive arrangement for many years. I'm disappointed to see his son squandering it on sentiment. Squandering it, Riker said, is an interesting word for refusing to keep funding the destruction of a child witness. She wasn't a child for very long after that night. None of us get to stay children once we see something like that. Gideon's eyes returned to Lena, and something in them sharpened, lost a fraction of its pleasant veneer. You have one chance here. The same chance I'm sure you've imagined 1,000 times over 14 years, lying awake somewhere, wondering what you'd say to me if you ever got it. Walk away right now. Disappear again. Properly, this time, with resources. With a new identity built by people who actually know what they're doing, instead of a rushed federal program that left a dead infant social security number floating around for anyone competent to find. Or stay here, in the rain, on this highway, and find out exactly how far I'm willing to go to make sure those crates reach their destination. You're threatening to kill me in front of 6 witnesses. I'm offering you a choice. What happens after you make it is simply consequence. He smiled then, the small, terrible, gentle smile she remembered from a basement doorway 14 years ago. The smile of a man who had never once in his life raised his voice because he had never once needed to. You always were a smart child, Lena. Smart enough to survive when most wouldn't have. I'd hate to see that intelligence wasted on a decision this foolish. Thunder rolled somewhere behind the clouds, low and long, and for a moment the only sound on that stretch of highway was rain hitting metal and asphalt, and the idling engines of 6 vehicles arranged in a standoff that had no clean exit for anyone. Lena's hand moved to the collar of the borrowed tactical vest, fingers brushing something small clipped just inside the fabric. A detail Riker hadn't noticed until this exact second. A tiny recording device Grant had pinned there before they left the house. The kind of insurance plan nobody had wanted to discuss out loud in case it jinxed the need for it. You're going to want to hear what I have to say, she said, and her voice had stopped shaking. Something in her posture had changed in the last 10 seconds. The curled, flinching woman from the marble hallway nowhere in evidence now, replaced by someone standing fully upright in the rain, chin level, eyes locked on the man who had spent 14 years living rent-free in every nightmare she'd ever had. I'm listening. Say it. All of it. The way you said it to him that night, right before you shot him. I want to hear you say it again now, out loud, to my face, instead of just to a 12-year-old hiding behind a door who couldn't tell anyone what she heard because nobody would believe a scared kid over a man in an expensive suit. Something flickered behind Gideon's calm for the first time. Not fear exactly, but the faint, almost imperceptible irritation of a man unaccustomed to being directed. You think I'm going to confess to murder on a public highway because a housekeeper asks me to? I think, Lena said, that you've spent 14 years believing nobody who matters would ever be standing close enough, or brave enough, or furious enough to ask you directly. I think you've gotten so comfortable with your own untouchability that you've forgotten what it feels like to be questioned by someone who already knows the answer and just wants to watch you say it anyway. She took one step closer, rain running down her face, indistinguishable now from anything else, the line between weather and tears gone entirely. Say it, Gideon. Tell me why. After all these years, after everything it cost to bury it, tell me why you killed him, and tell me why it was worth destroying my entire life to keep me quiet about it. For a long moment, Gideon Ashcroft simply looked at her, rain dripping off the brim of nothing, because he wore no hat, his silver hair flattening slowly under the storm, and something in his composed, bureaucratic patience seemed, for the first time in this entire confrontation, to genuinely consider the question instead of deflecting it. He was going to talk, Gideon said finally, and his voice had lost some of its pleasant lightness, settled into something flatter, almost bored. The voice of a man reciting an old, well-worn justification he'd told himself so many times it had stopped feeling like an excuse and started feeling like simple fact. 15 years of careful arrangements, judges and prosecutors and politicians all moving in the same comfortable direction, and one accountant with a guilty conscience decided the money mattered less than his peace of mind. People who decide that, at the wrong moment, in the wrong room, become liabilities. I removed a liability. It happened to be witnessed by a child who happened to grow into someone with an inconvenient memory and apparently an inconvenient amount of stubbornness. His eyes flicked to the recording device clipped to her vest, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore. Clever, truly. I'm almost proud. You just confessed to murder. I confess to nothing that will survive contact with my legal team on a recording obtained under what will be characterized very persuasively as duress and unlawful confrontation on a public roadway during an active federal evidence transfer that you and your associates illegally obstructed. His composure had fully returned now, smooth as poured concrete. You forget, Lena. I have spent 14 years building exactly the kind of protection that survives moments like this one. A recording is not a conviction. It is at best a headline that dies in a week. It's not just the recording. Riker's voice cut through the rain now, hard and final, and he held up his phone, screen lit, already connected, already mid-transmission. We've had a live uplink running since before you stepped out of that car. Financial records, wire transfers, my father's signature on the authorization that funded your law firm a month before the original hearing collapsed. The confession you just gave, streaming in real time to 3 federal contacts, 2 investigative journalists and a civil rights attorney who specializes in exactly this kind of historical witness suppression case. You didn't confess to us, Gideon. You confessed to everyone who matters simultaneously while standing in the rain congratulating yourself on your own foresight. The pleasant mask didn't crack so much as it simply, finally, stopped functioning. Gideon's face going still in a way that was somehow more frightening than any anger could have been. The stillness of a man recalculating in real time exactly how thoroughly the ground beneath him had just disappeared. Cut the feed, he said, not to Riker, not to anyone in front of him, but into a small radio clipped at his collar, his voice suddenly sharp with the first real urgency he'd shown all night. Now, whatever it takes. And that was when the night went very wrong, very fast. One of the contractors near the lead transport van braking position, weapon swinging up not toward Grant or the standoff at the center of the road, but toward Riker himself, toward the phone in his raised hand, the single point of failure that could be eliminated before the transmission finished. And Lena's voice tore through the storm in a scream that had no words in it at all, just raw animal warning, as Riker realized. Half a second too late, exactly how little time he had left to move. Grant moved before the thought finished forming in anyone else's head. He hit Riker low and hard, a shoulder driven into his ribs with the full weight of 9 years of training behind it, and both men went down into the wet asphalt half a second before the contractor's rifle fired. The shot went wide, cracking off into the dark field beyond the shoulder. And then Grant's own weapon was up, already firing, 2 rounds that caught the contractor in the shoulder and dropped him before he could correct his aim. The night exploded. Lena threw herself flat against the side of the car, hands over her head. Not the trained, silent flinch from the marble hallway 6 days ago. Something different now, something deliberate. A tactical crouch instead of a collapse. Because somewhere in the last 6 days, her body had relearned the difference between hiding from violence and surviving it. Around her, the highway dissolved into chaos, muzzle flashes strobing through sheets of rain, Grant's 2 men returning fire from behind the lead vehicle, one of the convoy's contractors shouting something about standing down that nobody could hear over the gunfire in the storm. It lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds that felt, to everyone on that stretch of highway, like the longest stretch of time any of them had ever lived through. Then it stopped, the way these things stop, not with a clean resolution, but with the abrupt, ragged silence of men realizing simultaneously that the fight had become unwinnable. 2 contractors down, one wounded badly enough to be screaming into the rain, the others backing away from their weapons with hands raised, because whatever Gideon Ashcroft was paying them, it had never included dying on a public highway for a cause they'd never been told the full truth of. Riker was still on the ground where Grant had tackled him, rain running into his eyes, ribs screaming where Grant's shoulder had connected, and the first thing he did once his hands stopped shaking enough to use them was check his phone. The screen was cracked. Spider-webbed glass across the display, dark in one corner where the impact had killed a section of the panel. But the transmission indicator, small and green in the top corner, was still blinking. Still live. Still connected. Still sending. "It's still going," he said, his voice raw, disbelieving. The feed never cut. Grant was already hauling him up by the back of his jacket, eyes scanning the wreckage of the standoff for any remaining threat, finding none. Then everyone who needed to hear that confession already has it. Whatever happens next, that part's done. Nobody can unsay what he already said. Across the road, Gideon Ashcroft stood very still beside his black sedan, rain plastering his silver hair flat against his skull, and for the first time in 14 years, for the first time perhaps in his entire adult life, his face had stopped performing calm. What was left underneath it wasn't panic, not quite. It was something colder and more clinical, a man doing rapid arithmetic on exactly how much of his life had just become unsalvageable and arriving with visible horror at a number too large to manage. He didn't run. Riker would think about that detail for a long time afterward. That even in the final collapse of everything he'd built, Gideon Ashcroft hadn't run, hadn't begged, hadn't done anything except stand very straight in the rain and watch the last 14 years of careful architecture come down around him with the same flat composure he'd probably worn while watching a man die in a basement. Federal vehicles arrived 11 minutes later. Vivian had already routed the live feed straight into the inboxes of 2 federal contacts who, it turned out, did not need much convincing once they saw an on-record murder confession streaming in real time alongside 15 years of documented financial corruption. By the time the first agency SUV pulled onto the shoulder, lights cutting through the rain in cold blue-white strobes, Gideon Ashcroft had already, quietly, without theater, put his hands behind his back and waited. He looked at Lena one final time as they walked him past her toward the waiting vehicle, rain still running down both their faces. And something passed between them that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite triumph either. Something closer to an ending. The specific, hollow finality of watching a monster that had lived in your chest for 14 years turn out to be, in the end, just a man, old and wet and finished. "You were always smarter than I gave you credit for," he said, the closest thing to an apology he was constitutionally capable of producing. "I know," Lena said. "I just had to survive long enough to prove it." They put him in the car. The door closed, and just like that, after 14 years, it was over. Not with the dramatic finality she'd imagined in 1,000 sleepless nights, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic efficiency of federal procedure. A man who'd controlled entire courts and careers for over a decade, reduced in the space of one rainstorm to a name on an intake form. The weeks that followed moved faster than any of them expected and slower, in the moments that mattered, than any of them could bear. The financial records Vivian had compiled, combined with the recorded confession and the additional evidence recovered from the intercepted transport, crates that, once finally opened under federal supervision, contained physical material the original conspiracy had spent 14 years assuming was already destroyed, triggered an investigation that moved through the legal and political establishment like a controlled demolition. Judges who'd quietly buried inconvenient cases over the years suddenly found their own records under scrutiny. A state senator resigned within a month, citing health reasons that satisfied no one. The law firm that had represented Gideon's network for over a decade dissolved within 90 days, its partners scattering to depositions and, in 2 cases, indictments of their own. Riker testified 3 separate times before it was finished, once before a grand jury, once in a deposition that lasted 11 hours, once in an open congressional hearing on judicial corruption that put his face and his father's name on every major news outlet in the country for a week. He did not soften any of it. His legal team begged him more than once to characterize his father's involvement as limited, as posthumous, as something the Foundation's board had executed without his father's full knowledge. Each time, Riker refused. "My father signed that authorization with his own hand," he said, on record, in front of cameras, in a hearing room that had gone very quiet to hear him say it. "I'm not interested in protecting a dead man's reputation at the cost of the truth. He made a choice. I'm not going to make a different one just because it's more comfortable." The company's board pushed back hard. 2 major shareholders divested within the month, citing reputational risk. His net worth dropped by an amount that would have terrified him a year earlier, and that he found, in the moment, he genuinely did not care about at all. He sold the Foundation's remaining assets, what was left after the legal settlements, after the restitution payments his lawyers structured for victims of the broader conspiracy wherever they could still be identified and located, and used the proceeds to seed something new entirely. Not a foundation with his family's name on the door. Something his father had never touched, never funded, never tainted with 14 years of buried money. He called it simply the Witness Protection Trust, and its sole purpose was funding legal support for witnesses in cases exactly like the one that had stolen Lena's childhood. People whose testimony threatened powerful interests, and who, historically, had nowhere safe to land once the powerful interests decided to fight back. Lena did not go back to being a housekeeper. It took her a long time to decide what she wanted to be instead, longer than anyone around her expected, because 14 years of building an identity designed to be invisible had left her with very little practice imagining a life designed to be seen. She spent the first month after Gideon's arrest mostly in silence, sitting in the garden under the magnolia tree, which had finally started to bloom, watching the world move around her with the cautious, disoriented attention of someone relearning how to exist in daylight after 14 years in shadow. Grant ran the DNA test he'd promised. It came back exactly the way he'd suspected. A confirmed familial match, not close enough to be parent and child, but close enough to mean something, close enough to mean that the family she'd believed entirely, completely gone for 14 years had, in fact, never fully disappeared. He didn't make a speech about it. He just told her the result over coffee in the kitchen one morning, plainly, the way he told her everything. And then he said, "I figured you'd want it confirmed before you decided what to do with it," and let her sit with that for as long as she needed. She cried again that day. Differently than the garden tears 6 weeks earlier, these came slower, and they didn't feel like grief. "I don't know how to have family," she told him eventually, once she'd stopped. "I've spent 14 years making sure I didn't need anyone enough that losing them could break me again." "Nobody's asking you to need anyone," Grant said. "I'm just telling you I'm here, however much or little use you want to make of that. Family's not a debt you owe somebody. It's just a door that stays open whether you walk through it or not." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The specific, deliberate gentleness of an offer with no obligation attached. The same shape, she realized eventually, as the handwritten note that had started all of this 6 weeks earlier. Maybe that was the thing she'd never learned in 14 years of running. That kindness without a price tag wasn't a trap waiting to spring. Sometimes it really was just kindness, offered by people who had decided, for reasons of their own, that her survival mattered to them, regardless of what it cost. In the 3rd month, she filed the paperwork to legally reclaim her name. It was a strange, almost anticlimactic process. A form, a fee, a clerk who stamped the document without once looking up to register what it meant for the woman standing in front of her. But when she walked out of that government building holding a piece of paper that said, "Officially, finally, Lena Mercer," instead of a stranger's borrowed identity built from a dead infant's social security number, she stood on the courthouse steps for a long time in ordinary daylight and let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in 14 years. Not safety, exactly. Safety still felt like a country she was visiting rather than a place she lived, but something close to it, something that might, with enough time, eventually become indistinguishable from it. She used the small settlement awarded to her, restitution from the dissolved foundation's remaining assets, a number that would never undo 14 stolen years, but that represented, at minimum, an acknowledgement that those years had been taken from her, rather than simply lost. To open the Mercer Justice Center in a converted brick building 6 blocks from the courthouse where she'd reclaimed her name. It was a small operation at first, a handful of lawyers willing to work for less than they were worth because the mission mattered to them. A part-time counselor for the specific particular trauma of being a witness whose testimony had cost them everything. A waiting room with soft chairs and good light, because Lena had insisted in the renovation meetings that the first thing anyone walking through that door needed to feel was that someone had thought about their comfort before they'd even arrived. Within a year, the center had a waiting list. Within 2, it had satellite offices in 3 states, and a reputation, quietly earned, as the place to go if you'd witnessed something powerful people wanted buried and you had nowhere else left to turn. Riker visited the center for the first time on a quiet spring morning, 14 months after the highway, 14 months after a confession streamed into the inboxes of federal agents while rain washed blood and water together on wet asphalt. He came alone. No security detail trailing him, no lawyers, no driver waiting at the curb with the engine running in case things went badly. He'd asked Lena, the week before, if it would be all right, and she'd said yes without hesitating, which had surprised him more than he expected it to. The lobby was full of morning light when he walked in, sun cutting through tall windows onto a waiting room where 6 or 7 people sat in soft chairs, some filling out intake forms, one woman quietly crying while a counselor sat beside her with a box of tissues and an expression of patient, unhurried attention. The whole room hummed with the specific energy of people whose lives had been broken by something and who had finally found a place willing to help them put the pieces back in an order that made sense. Lena was standing near the reception desk when she saw him, and for a moment neither of them moved, the lobby's quiet bustle continuing around them while they simply looked at each other across the room. A billionaire who'd burned down his own family's legacy to keep a promise written on a folded note, and a witness who'd spent 14 years disappearing and had finally, completely, stopped. She crossed the room toward him. "You came," she said. "You invited me. I half expected you to send flowers instead, less complicated." "I'm not interested in less complicated anymore." He looked around the lobby. The soft chairs, the morning light, the quiet, careful dignity of the whole space, and something in his face, watching it, looked almost like relief. "This is good work, Lena. This is exactly what should have existed 14 years ago, for you, and didn't. That's the whole point of it existing now." She studied him for a moment, the particular searching look she'd given him in his office on the worst day of this entire ordeal, except now there was nothing wary underneath it, nothing braced for disappointment. "How's the company? Smaller, less profitable, considerably less burdened by my father's ghost." He shrugged, and it was an honest shrug, no performance in it. "I sleep better than I used to. That's worth more than the stock price ever was." "And the trust? The one you built with the foundation money? Funded 11 cases in its first year. Witnesses who needed protection, legal support, relocation costs nobody else would cover. It's not enormous. It's not going to fix what's broken in the system. But it's something real, instead of something that just looked real on paper while quietly funding the opposite underneath." She nodded, and for a moment they simply stood there together in the bright lobby, the easy, unhurried silence of two people who had survived something together and no longer needed to fill every quiet moment with explanation. "I have something to ask you," Riker said finally, "and I want you to know there's no wrong answer. Whatever you say, nothing about this center, nothing about your life changes because of it. Ask." He extended his hand, the way he had in a marble hallway 14 months earlier, palm open. No pressure behind it, no expectation. The same gesture that had once sent her arms flying over her head in a flinch that had taken 30 seconds to fade and changed both their lives permanently in the time it took to happen. "I'd like to be part of your life," he said. "Not as your employer, not as someone funding your work from a comfortable distance. Just as a person who'd like to know you fully, the way I never let myself before, because I was too busy being careful about exactly how much I was allowed to want." This time, she didn't flinch. She looked at his open hand for a long moment, sunlight falling warm across both their wrists, the lobby humming quietly around them with the sound of people slowly, patiently, putting their lives back together. And she thought about a basement 14 years ago, and a calm voice that had taught her the world only ever rewarded silence. And she thought about a folded note that had asked for nothing, and a garden bench where a man who might be family had told her she wasn't as alone as she believed, and a highway in the rain where she had finally said her real name out loud without flinching. She reached out and took his hand, not because she needed rescuing. She had never needed that. Not really. She had survived 14 years entirely on her own resourcefulness, her own discipline, her own ferocious, unbreakable will to keep existing even when existing cost her everything else. She took his hand because, for the first time since she was 12 years old, she finally believed that letting someone close didn't automatically mean letting them hurt her. Because trust, she'd learned, wasn't something you extended on faith alone. It was something you built, slowly, deliberately. One kept promise at a time, the way Riker had kept his, the way Grant had kept his, the way an entire team of strangers had proven over 14 months and one terrible night on a rain-soaked highway that some people really did mean it when they said you were safe. Her hand was steady in his. No tremor, no flinch, just two people standing in morning light, choosing, deliberately, to face whatever came next together instead of alone. Outside, the spring sun climbed higher over a city that had no idea how close it had come 14 months earlier to losing the truth forever. And inside the Mercer Justice Center, surrounded by people whose broken lives were slowly, carefully being rebuilt, Lena Mercer stood in the lobby she'd built from the wreckage of her own survival and understood finally, completely, that the fear that had once defined every single day of her life no longer had any power left to take from her. The truth had survived. Justice had been done. As much as justice can ever truly be done. And two people who had each lost everything to a conspiracy 14 years in the making had found, in the wreckage of it, something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them, it turned out, had needed all along. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no easy resolutions in a story built on 14 years of stolen childhood and inherited corruption. Some wounds simply didn't close all the way, and some ghosts, like Gideon's calm, terrible voice, would likely visit her dreams for the rest of her life. But she would wake from those dreams in a world where her name was finally, truly her own. And that, after everything, was enough.